What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, and today we're going to be talking about the S300s in Syria. Okay, Alexander, we have a lot of news going on here in Syria with the announcement that S300s will be delivered to Syria in the coming 2 weeks. Let's begin with you describing exactly what the plan that the Russian military has set out for in Syria in order to provide the proper defense after the downing of the IL-20. And then after you describe the plan that's been set up, tell our viewers if you think this is a good move on the side of Russia.
Right. I'm very glad that you mentioned a plan, because what the Russians have described is not just a situation where they deliver S-300 missiles to Syria, an important enhancement of the Syrian air defense though that is. They have actually outlined a comprehensive plan to upgrade Syria's air defenses in a way that will protect Syria from air attack and also protect Russia's bases in Syria and Russia's personnel in Syria from the kind of attack that took place last week when the Russian IL-20 surveillance aircraft was shot down. So this is what the Russians are going to do. First, they're going to deliver S-300 missiles to Syria. This is a very advanced and very capable air defense system of a sort that the Syrians have not had up till now, which the Syrians tried to buy from the Russians before, which the Russians refused to deliver to Syria because they didn't want to make their relations with Israel more complicated. The Russians have now agreed to deliver it. This is a very powerful system. It can shoot down Israeli aircraft over Israeli territory, over Israeli airspace. So it greatly extends the reach of the Syrian air defense system. The second thing they've decided to do is that they're going to fully integrate the Syrian air defense system in Syria with their own air defense system in Syria, which is extremely advanced. And they're going to provide the Syrians with automated information from their own air defense computers. This means that the Syrians will be able to track Israeli, and not just Israeli, but also US or other countries' Air Force planes over their airspace using Russian radars. And Russia has very advanced radars working in Syria. So this was hugely advance the capabilities of the Syrian air defense system. The third thing they're going to do is perhaps the most aggressive thing they're going to do, which is that they're going to switch on, the Russians are going to switch on their very advanced jamming systems along the Syrian coast to make it very difficult or perhaps even impossible for hostile aircraft, Israeli or US aircraft, to operate near the Syrian coast in Syrian airspace. So in effect, that is almost like an air exclusion zone along the Syrian coastline. And last but not least, and this isn't something the Russians have disclosed, but we are hearing about this from media reports in the Middle East, the Russians are apparently again negotiating with Iran to set up a semi-permanent base, air base in Iran, and the expectation is that they're going to put there in that base very advanced military aircraft, perhaps long-range Tupolev bombers that can strike far further into the Mediterranean Sea from that base. So it is a comprehensive defense system that the Russians are creating in Syria. It will very much upgrade the Syrian air defense system. It will make it much less vulnerable to air attack by Israel and by the United States. And you ask the question, whether is this a good move? I think that it is a move that the Russians have probably had at the back of their minds for some time. They've been very careful not to escalate too quickly the Russians have played a steady incremental game. Whenever there is an air attack on Syria, they respond step by step by upgrading first their air defences and now Syria's air defences, making Syrian airspace increasingly dangerous to hostile aircraft, and the Russians have very cleverly used the shooting down of the IL-20 to achieve that. So is this a good move by the Russians? I think from the Syrian point of view and from the point of view of achieving Russian objectives in Syria, which is to secure Syria from foreign attack, I think this has to be treated as a good move.
Okay, Alexander, this is going to be Okay, Alexander, this is going to be a big question, so I want you to dissect it a little bit. What does all of this mean for all the players involved? You started to mention a little bit about Syria, so go into what this means for Syria and for Assad and the war that he's engaged in right now, especially with regards to Idlib. What does this mean for Turkey? And of course, what does this mean for Israel and the United States? Start with Syria, then take the other three in whatever order you want, because you started towards the end of the last segment to mention what this means for Syria. So cap it off there and move forward.
Right. Let's go back to when the Russians first moved into Syria in 2015. Now, it's been almost entirely forgotten. In fact, it's been deleted, if you like, from the memory of the Western media. But in the summer of 2015, the United States and Turkey were planning together to impose a no-fly zone across Syria. In other words, the US Air Force was going to patrol Syrian skies, shoot down any Syrian aircraft over Syria, bomb Syrian army, and bomb Syrian air defenses. And that was the plan. That was announced and talked about very openly in the media. I remember reading all about it in the Financial Times and in other places. And of course, the United States could do that because Syria's air defense system in those days, in 2015, though fairly advanced by Middle East standards, was no conceivable match for that of the United States. What has happened since 2015, since the Russians came to Syria, is that situation has steadily changed. In November 2015, after the Turks shot down a Russian Sukhoi-24 bomber, the Russians positioned S300 missiles in Syria, which is a very advanced system, more advanced than the S300. Then in October 2016, during the Battle of Aleppo, the Russians positioned the Ante 2500 air defense missile system in Syria. This is also an extremely advanced system, more advanced again than the S300. Then they positioned advanced radar systems, advanced jamming systems, after a shoot down by the US Air Force in July 2017 in northwest Syria of a Syrian aircraft, a Syrian Sukhoi-17 aircraft. The Russians prohibited the US from operating over Syrian airspace west of the Euphrates River, and that has continued. And now, after the latest incident, the Russians are also deploying S300 missiles to Syria. In fact, they're providing them to the Syrians themselves. They've also carried out a massive upgrade of Syria's own air defense system. So Syria has gone from a position in 2015 where it was unable to defend itself from the kind of air campaign that the US was planning against Syria at that time, to a situation now where Syria can fully defend itself and where it is becoming steadily less vulnerable to air attack by the United States and by Israel and by the other Western powers. So we are seeing a decisive shift in the balance of military power and in the balance of power in the air in Syria. Now, what does that mean for all the surrounding countries? It means that it is becoming almost impossible. It is effectively impossible for the United States to reverse the military situation in Syria, short of an all-out war, which the United States has never shown any desire to wage in Syria, against the Syrians and against the Russians. So the whole regime change project is gone, and the military position of the United States in Syria is becoming weaker. Israel, which has been allowed by the Russians to carry out bombing raids on various Syrian military installations and against the Iranians and the Hezbollah militia group, is going to find that its ability to continue to do that is going to be severely restricted. And Turkey has basically given up on the regime change project long ago, but must now contend with the reality that Syria presently possesses a more advanced and a more powerful air defense system than Turkey itself has. So that Syria, the balance of military power between Syria and Turkey, has shifted decisively in Syria's favour. So we have now a fundamental change in the entire military balance in Syria and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that means that the war in Syria is going to come even more closely now to an end.
Was this move coordinated, Alexander? Did Russia coordinate this? Not coordinate, but did they warn? And did they notify Israel, the United States, Turkey of what they're planning to do before the announcement came out?
No, I don't think they've actually given specific warnings. I suspect that they have been telling the Israelis for some time that there was going to be a strong reaction. But what the Russians have said ever since they first arrived in Syria in 2015, they've said to the Americans, to the Israelis and the Turks what their red lines in Syria are. And they are three. And when I say there are three red lines, the Russians have spoken about them many times. And it is extraordinary that no one in the Western media has reported them. First, the Russians have said that there must be no aerial attacks on their own personnel in Syria. So if the US or Israel or Turkey attacks Russian military personnel, there will be a very strong reaction from the Russians. And that, of course, is exactly what we're seeing now. That's why all these deployments are happening. So that's the first red line. The second red line is that there will be no attacks by the US, by Israel, or by Turkey on the Syrian army whilst it is carrying out military operations against people that the Russians define as jihadi terrorists. If that happens, again, the Russians will react very strongly, as they did a year ago, when, as I said, they prohibited US aircraft from flying west of the Euphrates River. And the third red line is that, of course, if there is any kind of bombing campaign on Syria intended either to establish a no-fly zone or to overthrow the Syrian government, then that is also unacceptable to Russia, and Russia will act to prevent it. So, we have now seen the Israelis cross the first of those red lines. They carried out a bombing attack on Syria, as a result of which 15 Russian servicemen were killed in the IL-20. And we have seen the reaction from the Russians as they enforce their red line. And by doing so, they are, of course, reducing the scope of operations for the Israeli Air Force and for all the others. They may not have given the Israelis an immediate warning that that was what they would do, but they have been warning the Israelis and the Americans and the Turks and everyone else about their red lines from the moment they first arrived in Syria back in September 2015.
And finally, Alexander, to finish up on this news and what's going on, Putin got a lot of flack for what happened with the downing of the IL-20. A lot of people said he's a weak leader. He's kowtowing to the Israelis. All these things were floating around the internet, especially about Putin and the way he reacted to what happened. What is this move? What does this say about Putin's calculus and his leadership in Syria?
Well, it's what you and I have been saying all along. First of all, he is a very strong leader who leads a very strong and very powerful country. And people must never forget this. I mean, Russia is a military superpower. But the second thing is, he is a very calculating leader. And not just him, by the way, but the entire Russian leadership. I mean, there's that famous expression that Theodore Roosevelt once made about the United States, that the United States talks soft and carries a big stick. Not true at all of the United States nowadays, dare I say. They talk very big all the time, and often they don't carry very much of a stick at all. With the Russians, it is absolutely true. They do talk soft, and they carry an enormous stick. And they are extremely careful, and they think through very carefully before they use it. And can I say, that is how a great power should behave. It should always act in a measured and calculated way. The United States all too often doesn't. Russia invariably does. That is why the Russians tend to win their wars. That is why the Americans rarely do.
And real quick, Alexander, with regards to the Idlib agreement and the DMZ, does this move affect that part of the conflict and what was agreed upon between Russia and Turkey with Idlib and the DMZ? Does this move factor into the Idlib agreement?
Absolutely. And of course, in ways that I'm sure that Putin and Erdogan did not anticipate when they made that agreement, because of course the Israeli raid came just afterwards. But what of course it does is that it increases Russian and Syrian control over their own airspace. Now, this is important because in the run-up to the Idlib agreement, there were all these threats coming from the United States and from the other Western powers, from France and Britain and even to some extent Germany, that they would take military action if the Syrian army entered Idlib. And military action, they mean they'd make missile strikes and air strikes on the Syrian military. And what they now find is that the Syrian air defense has, in response to this Israeli air attack, but also possibly to some extent in response to those threats, been upgraded very significantly, which means that any strikes on the Syrian military at any time in connection with Idlib and any operation the Syrian army takes to free Idlib will be much more difficult and possibly unsustainable and may come with very heavy costs. So it will make the United States, hopefully, pause before it takes such a step. And it is very interesting that there are now reports circulating today that John Bolton, who is Donald Trump's national security advisor, and who is the person who is widely believed to have been behind those threats that were being made of US military action against Syria in the event of an offensive against Idlib. It seems that he has now agreed to meet with the secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, his opposite number in Moscow. And I anticipate that the Russians will be explaining to Bolton, Patrushev especially, will be explaining to Bolton in very clear and very direct language that the kind of threats the United States was making over the summer in connection with Idlib will no longer be tolerated. And of course, looking forward, and remember, we've always discussed this, and we've discussed this many times, the Idlib situation, many times on our programs, looking forward, when the time comes for the Syrian army to move into Idlib and to free Idlib from the jihadis there. And I'm absolutely sure that day will come, and that it will come soon. When that happens, all the outside powers, the United States, Israel, and Turkey, and the United States allies, Britain and France, will know that they interfere in that operation to free Idlib very much now at their own risk.
Oh, but Bolton is a hothead for sure. So, I mean, I can't imagine this going over well with him. Is there even the slightest chance, Alexander, the slightest possibility that Bolton may actually press the issue and wage what you said earlier in the segment, that all-out war?
Well, I think Bolton is perfectly capable of doing it. I think the uniformed military in the United States, people like General Mattis, who is the Defense Secretary, people like General Dunford, who is the Chief of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, they will not be so keen. And of course, Bolton is a civilian. He doesn't have much connection with the military directly. He may be an arch hawk, but if the military come along to Donald Trump and say, look, you may want us to go off and attack Syria in these sort of ways, but you risk very severe military losses if we do so, with a threat of an incalculable escalation if we go further, then I wonder, frankly, I very much doubt that Donald Trump will want to go there. And Bolton, who may be an extreme hardliner and a very extremely belligerent individual, he is a political survivor also. And I think he will also understand, if it's explained to him in that way by the Russians, that this is just too dangerous a game for the United States, for the Trump administration, and ultimately for himself as well.
Right. I guess you could, I don't know if you could say it, but maybe you could say checkmate Russia. Would you say that?
I think we are almost at checkmate. I don't think we're quite there. But you see, I come back to what I was saying. The Russians move their pieces very incrementally and very steadily. If they try to send all these things together at one go, right at the beginning, in September 2015, they might have provoked a reaction. But by moving one piece in at a time, they're building up an absolutely overwhelming position in Syria. And I think we are close to that point now, when the position in Syria is overwhelming, and that the United States and Israel and Turkey, however much they don't like it, will just have to lump it.
Well, let's hope we're approaching that point so the conflict can finally end.
Exactly.
Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran, and in the description box down below, you'll find links to our PayPal page and our Patreon page. Donate so we can continue to put out broadcasts like this to you and for you. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Until next time, take care.